proclaim that this weekend we would all set aside some time to fast and pray. And the question could rise, a simple question: how come? Why? Why now? And I think one of the obvious answers is, and perhaps you would say the same thing, because we acknowledge that we are living in uncertain times. We're living in the shadow of an unusual coronavirus, which has threatened to the populations of various countries. And we have not seen the last of it yet, especially as it extends its tentacles into other nations around the world, especially in Africa, that have not been hit yet, but could be even more vulnerable with lower immunity systems. So this is a prime concern to many people, and certainly for the church. We have brethren in these areas. I'm starting to get a few phone calls from people that are out there that are wondering, wow, is there a spiritual connection to what's going on? I've never seen a country like this. I've never seen an economy shut down before. People that have anxieties. I was up till 2 a.m. talking to a relative recently who was asking me for the first time in a decade about prophecy and remembering things that we had talked about in the past that now are history that have happened. I'm glad for the interest. I wish there was much more. I hope that I get many more phone calls. Victor Kubik made a statement several different times that he feels, from his vantage point, that we are on the threshold of doing a lot more in the church, that our best days or months are yet ahead of us. And I could make a case in this sermon that that is the case, but it's certainly nothing to take for granted. I'd like to talk today about the subject of fasting. And I would like to point out that a primary reason to fast is to receive God's divine guidance for the church as a whole. I'd like to repeat that. A primary reason to fast is to receive God's divine guidance for the church as a whole. The title of this sermon is Famous Fasts of the Church of God and Why They Work. And again, I think that bears repeating. Famous fasts of the Church of God and why they have worked. So often, a subject like this, what we're talking about, the church fast, needs to be framed in a wider context. I think that there's so much that we can learn from the past and see how Mr. Armstrong, for example, when he was alive, handled things, and how different other leaders since that time have done so. And the church has moved on its knees in the past and on its stomach, in a sense, that it has dedicated days to fast. Now, there are multiple reasons why a Christian would fast. You fast to get close to God. We would fast to maybe find the spiritual strength to overcome a sin or an addiction. Repeated fasting can certainly do that. We fast to humble ourselves before God. I remember Isaiah 66 and verse 2, which says, "To this man will I look, a person who is humble and of a contrite heart." And fasting can enable us to be in that kind of a position, and we get God's attention better when we have that connection, when we have His undivided attention, looking at our willingness to humble ourselves and be looking to Him for answers and looking to Him for guidance. We also can fast for health benefits, but a good fast will encompass all of those different aspects, and it will encompass a fifth reason, and I say it's a primary reason to fast. We have to realize that fasting should not be a last resort. If people fast as a last resort, oh no, everything else failed, I guess I've got to fast. I'm out of money. I'm out of ideas. I'm making too many mistakes. I guess last-ditch effort, I'll fast. It's better to do that than not to do that. But a seasoned Christian is not going to wait till there's a crisis to fast. And the church is not necessarily in a crisis. In fact, God has been extremely, very good to this church, very merciful. And in spite of the economic downturn in the United States and in other nations throughout the world, God has seen to it that the church has been able to operate uninterruptedly with its projected income. and it has continued to come in. And so with fear and trembling, we try to spend the money as carefully as we can. I mean, we have a huge responsibility to do that. And it's how better to do that, to be closer to God and to occasionally fast. So fasting is something that a seasoned Christian is going to do on a regular basis, not just on the Day of Atonement, assuming there are no health conditions, no diabetic issues to deal with. And even then, somebody could modify his or her fast in order to comply with the directive given from church administration. Otherwise, though, if we wait till we have a crisis every time, we'll be on an emotional roller coaster. And I think we've all known people that'll bounce from crisis to crisis to crisis. And that is wear and tear in the body that doesn't have to happen. And that can be trauma, whereas the seasoned veteran is going to pace oneself, periodically fast. Fast before there are problems. Fast to even get much closer to God in order to think more clearly, to think more directly. You know, it says the closest, it says, we all know that the closest point between distance between 2 points is a straight line. Well, how true that is spiritually, too. If we get closer to God, then we don't meander and deviate off the path which wastes time and then leads us to a certain crisis if we are negligent and are not close to God. So these are important considerations. But when we talk about fasting, this is not something that's a strange idea. It should not be a last-ditch resort. It should be something that we should be very positive about. It will make us a better person, better Christian, stronger spiritually, have more response with God. These are things that we don't want to live without. There's a statement over in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. I won't have time to turn there, but it says we walk by faith and not by sight. It takes time to get to that point. It takes even more time to be able to be comfortable with and maybe even enjoy being in that situation. But we are at a point at this with the church, with this coronavirus, with this situation, we're at what I would call a where do we go from here moment. Where do we go from here? And the answer is we don't exactly know. We can think and project and come up with plans, but are they God's plans? Are they right? They will be right if we're close enough to God in order to have His help. Hence the need to fast. Church leaders for thousands of years have understood even what Christ had said to his disciples. There are times that certain issues are settled by fasting. By fasting, God is able to, we get closer to God, He's able to get closer to us and steer our thinking so that we're not just wandering, wasting time, that we have a more direct route to His will be done in our lives. It makes me remember of different fasts of the past that the church called for. And I still save some of the letters, even coworker letters from the 60s and 70s and 80s. Not that I advocate that we live in the past. Things have changed, not just technology, but some of our perspective has changed as a church. And our perspective on Bible prophecy certainly has changed. But the closer we are to God, the more spiritual successes we'll have in our own lives and in the life of the church as a whole. We need that. And there have been times when the church has been in crisis or faced certain dangers, had various challenges. It was true in Mr. Armstrong's day. It was true in Peter Walden's day, in Polycarp's day, in the day of the apostles. In the last 2,000 years, it's always been that way. Satan the devil has been an adversary that has tried to dethrone and derail the church, and we know that. We've seen his handiwork, even maybe in our lives, but certainly in the lives of brethren. We have seen what's happened the last 50 or 60 years. I vividly remember certain fasts that the church called for. The very first one that I remember experiencing was in November of 1972. And this was a time when Mr. Armstrong, being the head of the church, had a sense from his point of view that the church was entering a lethargic phase that it needed to be snapped out of. And he used an example of Abraham Lincoln, who back in 1863, during the height of the Civil War, called for a nationwide fast. And the idea was presented to him, and he liked it. And so in March, I believe, of 1863, that's when the nation as a whole was called upon to repent. I'm not sure that everybody did, but for those that were willing to fast, humble themselves, trust in God, I think that God was moved very much to intervene. And if not immediately for the country, certainly for the loved ones, and maybe for people that some of these people, those that turn to God, they would be very, very open to God's blessings, and God may have spared some of their relatives that might have been in the war. So November of 72 was certainly a time. March 3rd, 1974, I'll never forget that period of time. It was the first time that the church was threatened by uh, a breakaway group that ended up leaving, and their list of grievances were quite long, and I vividly remember hearing about some of those. And two of their grievances were actually legitimate. They demanded that the church uh, accept their understanding that Pentecost would be celebrated on Sunday. They didn't just suggest, they demanded it. I note the attitude. And then they were very concerned about the view of divorce and remarriage, and they demanded that that be looked into. And lo and behold, the church, under careful examination and study, concluded that they were right. But they're no longer with us. Their attitude was rotten. And a number of the other things that they accused, I will not mention here in the interest of remaining in an edified posture instead of going through some of the mudslinging. That was an important turning point. And right after the church fasted, the income jumped to a 30% increase again. It had been doing that in decades prior. January 1979, I'll never forget that. I can remember driving down 56th Street, wondering what's on the news at noon. And the announcer said, and turning to Pasadena, California, in the Worldwide Church of God, the state of California is put it into receivership with allegations of $70 million being mishandled. And counsel for the church claims this entire accusation is unconscionable. As it turned out, there were a number of illegalities that were committed. The church fasted on several occasions, different people did, and eventually we gave God the credit, but the church was granted exoneration by the state of California, and the receivership was lifted. No harm was done. The allegations that were so wild, such as the church absconded with $70 million. How do you do that when your income is maybe $150 million? How do you make $70 million disappear and still meet payroll, pay all the bills, cover the TV and radio, and so forth? It just didn't make sense. Even the Pasadena Police Department, that had such high regard for the church, basically called in sick on the day that they were supposed to go apprehend people and to shut down the campus. And then that all was rescinded eventually. That was quite a time. And if you've never heard of it or never experienced something like that, you might pinch yourself and think, come on, did that really happen? Oh, yeah, it did. And other things have happened. We've seen unusual challenges in ways that we never would have expected. And it's always important to be close to God, to be able to know how to handle those, what to say and when to say it and what not to say. And these things happen if you're close to God. If you're not, who knows what would happen. There's never a time to take a spiritual vacation. I think we know that by now. January 1986. That was a crossroads because that was when Mr. Armstrong died just a few days before with the help of his assistant. he was Aaron Dean. He was composing, or with Aaron's help, his last coworker letter. As he began it, he said, "This is my first letter to you, 1986, and could very well be my last. Now in my 94th year, I am in a very physically weakened state, enduring severe pain with virtually no strength whatsoever. I briefly described my condition in the last month's coworker letter to you, and now it has worsened. It may be that the work of God has given me, what work God's given me to do is complete, but not the work of the church of God." And for those that have complained, thought, "Oh, the work was done all a long time ago. We just have to take care of ourselves now." Well, yeah, we have to have God's help to take care of ourselves, absolutely. But the work is still going on. And I've challenged people that have made that point. I said, if the work ended in 1979 or in 1986 or some other date, then how is it that God has still called new people? Why, if we shut down the work back then, none of these people would have ever found out about the church. It's ridiculous. It's satanic. So Mr. Armstrong concluded this. And another thing about Mr. Armstrong, I think that we understand he is not a deity. He is not a God. Every time he sneezed, it wasn't inspired. He didn't have the best ability to judge and size up people like his wife did. When she died, I think the church lost a lot. We didn't have the benefit of his experience, even when he made mistakes. But we can learn from him. We are not to deify him as a God. He doesn't rule from the grave. He would deny any efforts of anybody to try to build him up in that way. On the other hand, we don't disown him either. God worked with him, even as an imperfect person as he was. God was able to do a great end time work. At his house one time, I asked him, did you ever expect the work to become worldwide?" He says, "Oh, no, I didn't." He said, "I envisioned a regional activity, and then maybe we could expand it out of state, but I never expected it to be what it was." And maybe that is just perfect, because then he would easily be able to say, as I hope any of us would say in his position, "I didn't do this. It wasn't the work of me. It was a work of God through us, God answering our prayers and honoring our fasting from time to time to enable the church to be in a position to grow." Because whenever there would be a fast, then afterwards the church would lunge ahead. There would be renewed energy, increased unity, increased income. Every indicator would be positive. So we have to have a balanced view of any of our former church leaders, whether it be Ellis LaRavia, who recently died, or Gerald Waterhouse, or Herbert Armstrong, or Peter Waldo, or any of the other people that have been a part of the leadership of the church. There was once Moses, and he was on the scene for a long time, and then the time came when he was replaced. And God has done that for the last 2,000 years. So I just want to make mention that we have to have the right perspective on these past leaders and learn what we can from them. But they many times were at a moment where they would say, "Well, where do we go from here?" And over and above regular contact with God, it was recognized that there was a need to have fasting and have a church-wide fasting in order to strengthen the impact of God's blessing to the church. So in January of 86, Mr. Armstrong died. And in the final thoughts, when he could think about anything and everything that he wanted to say and pass on. Imagine if you were on your deathbed. What would you want to say to other people? Hang in there? Or I forgive everybody of everything that I forget, or whatever. Different things will come to different people, different thoughts and ideas. But Mr. Armstrong's last thought, each of you, quote, "must commit yourself to support God's work." We already know that. But he had to fast and pray. God's work must push ahead this coming year as never before. God is opening up new doors in television and in the Plain Truth distributions. Help us walk through them. Pray and thank God and pray for his work. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for your prayers and for me personally. Okay, that was January of 86. He died. The church rallied behind the successor, and there was prayer and fasting, and the church was on the threshold of bigger things, and bigger things came. The circulation of the magazine grew to 8 million people. In the next few years, the income grew to 200 million annual income. We were the number one TV program on the earth. Doors were opening, and it was a very promising time, and we hit new plateaus. And then, of course, there was apostasy. And most of you know how that played out, so I'm not going to rehash that here. But that was an important milestone. And so instead of ending, the church leaped ahead, at least for several years. There were some very fine growth years that followed the death of Mr. Armstrong. But as the church compromised with the Bible, God withdrew blessings. And then when loyal ministers were forced or demanded to preach heresy instead of the truth, for example, on something as basic as the Sabbath, then that made it impossible. That made it impossible to deal with, and the church had to look for other solutions. That was the spring of 1995. There was the need to uphold doctrinal integrity. And again, those of us that were there, and that includes many of you, were at a point where we said, where do we go from here? We need divine direction. We need God to help us. I quoted 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7 earlier, which states that the just shall walk by faith and not by sight. The advantage of that is that if we are close to God, then we will implement his will. We try to do that with ordination. That is preceded by prayer and fasting. It's not my idea or somebody else's. It's what does God think? What does God want? And it takes time to be sure. And then there's always a danger of making a mistake. Paul said, lay hands on no man suddenly. Have to be careful. We have to be careful how we spend money. We have to be careful what we commit ourselves to. We need to be close to God for these things. In 1998, the church as we know it survived a vote of no confidence by a group of people, and that necessitated prayer and fasting for the church worldwide. It's interesting looking back at some other letters and notes. On June 5th, 2005, the church United Church of God proclaimed a fast in order to grow, to have more impact. And assuming that and thinking that would please God, the leadership decided to do that. A jump start. And the biggest result from that was the number of hits that we started to receive on the web page. And that has continued to climb. And that has been a very, very inspiring development. In January of 2011 was another crossroads for the church. And there was a need for a worldwide fast. And the church landed on its feet. And it was amazing how, in spite of all the difficulties that were foisted on it in that particular year, that we didn't miss a beat. We had enough personnel to manage what needed to be managed, and were successful. But you can well imagine, if you weren't there personally, that was a where do we go from here moment. And something that the brethren all shared in together. And we are at the crossroads once again. The reason why we have a fast this weekend is we're wanting to know, where does the church go from here? Do we spend more money in advertising? Do we do more with TV and radio? Do we spend money that we don't have to go out on faith? Or do we need to shore up funds for the ministry and for taking care of the brethren, which is a very high priority that's been reiterated in recent time by our president? All of it's important. We have many choices, many options. What can God do to be effectuating various miracles that can exceed us beyond what we would do on our own? One of the wonderful blessings that happened in our early church infancy was when back in about the first or second year that we had formed in the 1990s anyway, the church financed an ad for Reader's Digest in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, we didn't have the money to send it everywhere. If we covered London, we'd have to ignore Liverpool and Bristol and Edinburgh and so forth. We had to pick and choose. We could only reach about 10% of the British Isles, but it was an opportunity, and there was enough money in the budget, and so the leadership there decided to go walk through that open door. Guess what? Even though people were praying about it, Reader's Digest had a mental lapse. They forgot to run the ad. So when representatives of the church called them and says, "Hey, what's going on?" "Oh, we're so sorry," they said. "We're so sorry, but we'll make it up to you. For the same money, why don't you let us run that same ad in all 10 sections of the United Kingdom, so that then you can cover British Isles totally, Scotland and Ireland, Wales, and England." And that's what we did. So God multiplied the money. We got 10 times the coverage for the same money. Then, as I mentioned in the sermon last week, there have been times where God has chosen deliberately to fight against great odds with a small army of people. And so we've seen that that's been God's nature in the past. And you look at Gideon's army, 300 people instead of the 20,000 that he started out with, up against maybe 1 million people. And God is one that likes to see where one will chase 10 or 100, and 100 will chase 1,000. You have this incredible leverage with God that he can work out what we're unable to do for ourselves. But he cannot work out our attitudes, our willingness to dedicate. He can turn up the pressure. He can change circumstances externally, but it's up to us. Again, I keep reiterating, there are times when we don't know. We rely on God. I've used the example where one minister years and years ago introduced Mr. Armstrong and before Sabbath services, before his sermon, that is. He said, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the head of the founder of the Philadelphian Year of the Church." That's what he said. When Mr. Armstrong got up there, he said, "I deny that. I totally disagree with the speaker. I am not the founder of this church. Jesus Christ is." And he knew that. I know that he knew that when he told me, when I face to face. No, I never expected to get this big, but he was always wanting to go forward. In Psalm 127, to conserve time, I'll just quote it. It says, "Unless the Lord builds the house," then if we don't incorporate God into this fast and ask for him to help us in our future and in our church decision making, we're going to miss the mark. We're going to waste time and money. We're going to be aggravated. We can't afford to ignore that God has to be in charge, and we have to yield to him. So think back, and while you do, let's go over to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Here in 1 Samuel 16, the prophet Samuel was sent by God to anoint the next king of Israel. And so he came to the house of Jesse. And this was we read in 1 Samuel 16. 1 Samuel 16 and verse 2. Okay, I'll read from the NLT here. It says in verse 2, Samuel said, to God, "I'm, reluctant to go and anoint somebody else as king, because King Saul will hear about it and he'll kill me. And God reassured him. And he says, you take a heifer with you and make a sacrifice to the Lord, and then head to Bethlehem. And then when people ask, why are you here? You can explain that you come in peace, that you're here to perform a sacrifice, and nobody, even the king, will think twice about your travel. And then you will meet, he said, the house of Jesse. And when Samuel arrived, he took one look at Eliab. I guess he would be the oldest son. He said, surely this is the Lord's anointed. Surely God wants me to anoint this person. I mean, it's obvious. He looks like he's the king already. And he has a stature. He has perhaps a fine personality. So surely this is the Lord's anointed. And maybe in a whisper, I don't know how, but God said to Samuel, don't judge him by his appearance or his heart, for I've rejected him. He's not mad at him. He said, I don't choose him. The Lord doesn't see the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks upon the heart. Then Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. And Samuel said, no, this is not the one that God has chosen. Then the next one in line was Shimea, and Jesse summoned him. And Samuel said, no, this is not the one. Do you have any other sons here? Well, I got one. He's kind of on the young side. He's out with the sheep, but bring him in here. So David came and stood there among his brothers. In verse 13, and Samuel took the flask of olive oil that he had brought, and he anointed King David with oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. So that is a lesson recorded that we can't look on the outward appearance. Sometimes things that don't make sense to us now will later. On the other hand, there are proverbs that say there's a way that seemeth right that can end up in the ways of death. Or Jeremiah 10, verse 23 and 4, that God acknowledges that man does not always naturally know how to be. And so he needs God in his life. The closer we get to God, the more obvious certain decisions that have to be made will arise and be obvious. It becomes important. In James 4 and verse 6 through 8, you can't ignore a scripture like this on a subject like fasting. James chapter 4 and verse 6 through 8 says, you have, 4 verse 6, but God gives us even more grace to stand against such evil desires. As the scripture says, God opposes or resists the proud and gives favor to the humble. So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. That's a wonderful blessing, that kind of reassurance. And I'll just refer to 1 Peter 5, verse 8, where God inspires Peter to say, be sober, be vigilant, be ready for anything. Spiritually speaking, that's going to be possible upon repentance and fasting. I'd like to read from one excerpt of the autobiography. Well, actually, two. And they're extremely important. The one that I want to start off with is when Mr. Armstrong fasted for his very first time. He didn't really know how to do it. There was nobody to spell it out. I mean, he knew he would go without food and water, but beyond that, let me read the account. It's on page 390 in volume 1, entitled Astounding Answers to Prayer. Never in my life have I been faced with a more serious problem than the situation that confronted us at the beginning of the year of 1930. If you think that we're facing major challenge now with the economy, Just think back to or read about that time and how difficult it was for so many people. Not only were we confronted with another lean year economically, with our own personal financial condition at rock bottom, with the whole nation plunging on down, down, down into the depths of depression, but it seemed as if we were destitute of faith in God as well. It wasn't, meant to be that way. He writes, we were within 6 weeks of the birth of our fourth child. My wife, who had been so miraculously healed in 1927, was now in an alarming condition. She was anemic. Her blood was lacking iron. Her strength appeared depleted. The doctor definitely alarmed. He was afraid of the complications at the time of delivery. She was pregnant and about ready to give birth. He insisted she go to the hospital where every emergency facility would be available in the event of trouble. But we had been in such financial debts that the hospital bill for our first son's birth had not been paid. The hospital would not admit my wife again until the previous bill was paid, or else we paid in advance. I prayed for Mrs. Armstrong's healing. But she had not been healed. I prayed again and again, but there was no improvement, and time was running out. We were becoming desperate. What was wrong? I had heard that God does heal. We had experienced almost incredible miracles. My wife had been healed before, but why not now? He read over the conditions of healing. He read 1 John 3:22, where we ask whatever we will of him because we keep his commandments. I had surrendered to obey God's commandments 3 years before. Faith is the second condition, but I believed as firmly as when God healed my wife the first time. There was no more time to lose. Remember, I earlier said we can waste time and money. Time is not an unlimited commodity for us. He said there was no more time to lose. I had to find an answer. I knew one way: fasting and prayer. Fasting and prayer. Just what he had said at the end of his last coworker letter to all the members. What he says, fasting was a last-ditch resort. I didn't know how to fast, pray. I'd never done it before. But when Jesus' disciples were unable to cast out a demon, Jesus said, such a result comes only by fasting and prayer. So I began to fast. Oh, time is running away from me here. And so he concluded that he had been so, not intentionally, been so absorbed in trying to survive and trying to make the ends meet, that he was slaving over a business he was trying to start up when everything else seemed to be failing. And many other distractions were crowding out connections with God, prayer and study time with God. And so he came to that conclusion, and he repented. He had fasted all day Saturday, and he was into Sunday, and they were out of food. They had no money. They had no heat, and it was cold in Oregon in that time of year. And so everything seemed to be against them, and there were additional needs. And so he prayed, and as he was praying, his parents came up the driveway. They unannounced visit of surprise. And he said, Father, Mr. Armstrong said, Father, forgive me for being so caught up in this play project to try to keep my family alive, this business I was trying to launch. Forgive me for getting distracted with other things. I didn't do that intentionally, but please help me. He was dedicating an hour to prayer, then an hour to think about what he prayed about, then an hour to study, and then he would rotate that again and then again. And that, I think, was inspired because that is a winning strategy. When people fast, they can not only pray, but then they reflect and then they read additional things that inspires more prayer. I feel sorry for the people that sit around a table and just wait for the day to get over with, or the allotted time. That's insane. Not necessary. When we can be achieving important results and getting closer to God, it just helps us as well as collectively it helps the church as a whole. Incredibly important. So he concluded that he himself had allowed himself to drift, and there was a price to pay for that. As soon as he ended his prayer, he came out. There his parents were. They had cooked a huge amount of food that they wanted to give the family. And they had a trunk load of chopped wood that would supply heat that they needed. And everything seemed to fall into place in some other unusual circumstances I don't have time to cover. But this was a course correction, and every fast basically is, unless somebody is self-disciplined. I'm going to fast every so many uh, days or months or whatever it is, whatever the right strategy is for you. A second area that passage of the autobiography that I choose to uh, use is about an incident that happened in 1967 in April. It was a very, very significant turning point in the church because this is when Mr. Armstrong's wife Loma died. That was a huge loss to the church. We no longer, as an organization, had the benefit of her discernment, working with other people and reading people, being the advisor to her husband that she was. That was a huge loss, and he knew that it would be if she were allowed to die. She had issues with her bowels, and she could not hold food down. And this went on for weeks and weeks. And I'm reading from volume 2. This is around page 459. He writes to the members here in April of 1967. Meanwhile, dear brethren, I have been under the heaviest cloud for years. My dear wife has been stricken with a serious intestinal condition. For 3 weeks now, she's been confined to bed. Everything possible was done, including, of course, anointing her and asking God to heal her. We thought it might be appendicitis at first, but under fasting, an attack like that would resolve itself naturally. So she went without food for so long. And we've consulted God many times for healing. We've consulted the medical advice of one of our members, a doctor, who is no longer in medical service, but in God's service. He said the time had come to stand still and commit it to God's hands. And for the next couple of weeks, things did gradually get better. But then it started to tailspin. And he pleads here in this letter, and he says that it was a wake-up call for him. He didn't know that he had been drifting, but he admitted to his audience that he had. He says, during this ordeal, I fasted. Don't recommend this to most people. I fasted for 10 days. I don't know if he added some liquid to that. 10 days, though. I did not fast for her because we do not bring God, quote unquote, to our terms by suffering or doing penance. I fasted to bring myself closer to God. When that was accomplished, I broke the fast. I had been concerned over a heart condition and high blood pressure. I was slowed down in my work. Now that was gone. The heart condition that I have felt for some 4 years is no longer noticeable. I have renewed verve, bounce, and energy. God has, in this fasting and prayer, opened my eyes to many things, changed my entire daily routine, and brought me far closer to Him. So you could say that this crisis was a blessing in disguise. And other people in the ministry had concluded they had done the same thing. And there were two other ministers' wives, Mrs. Glenn White and Mrs. Harold Jackson, that were also in danger. And I believe they both got healed. And everybody was expecting the same for Loma. and she died. And Mr. Armstrong wrote his next coworker letter saying, "This ended in a way that I least expected." And he was stunned. And he missed her for the rest of his life, basically. But that was a turning point for the church. Where do we go from here? And when the church yields itself to God, you have that. And the church did in 1967. I wasn't in the church then, but I talked to a number of people who were, some that would go up the hill to the Armstrong home and take turns praying out loud, all these people on their knees, asking for God's help. All the leaders of the church were there. And it was in Mrs. Armstrong's doll room. She had a collection of dolls from all over the world. And when we took a tour of the house, Mr. Armstrong said, "You see this room here? A lot of prayers and a lot of fasting happened here. A lot of contact with God happened here." So where did God's hand go? If he didn't resurrect Loma Armstrong, what was his answer to the great push? And to me, one of the most inspiring parts of the history of 2,000 years of the church happened here. I have to condense what could be hours of discussion into just a few minutes. But in this time, or right after this, there was a person over in Germany that worked in the office, the German office that we had, who had a copy of the 1966 Envoy, pictures of Ambassador College, all three campuses at the time, and showed a friend, or the friend saw the book, says, "Can I look at that?" and paged through it. And said, "This is amazing." I can't remember if he wanted to take it home and show some other people. I think that's right. But eventually it got into the hands of King Leopold of Belgium. And he said, "I want to meet the man that built this college." And so that led to a relationship with Mr. Armstrong. And it led to him coming to visit the campus in Pasadena in 1970. Along with that, there was another person that found out about the college, was very, very impressed with that, and wanted to see the college himself. And that was Professor Benjamin Lazar, who was considered the archaeological expert of the Middle East, certainly in among the Israeli activity. He's deceased, but his daughter has followed in his steps and is the head archaeologist, the head authority in all of the nation of Israel. Okay, Benjamin Mazar came to Pasadena and was incredibly impressed. He was impressed with the students, and he said to the administration, "I have an archaeological dig going on in the southern part of Jerusalem, and we think it could be very significant. We think that it could be, in fact, the throne of David, King David. And I am inviting your students to participate in that dig because of the caliber, their appearance, the fact that they seem clean cut, they seem to be moral and very willing to help." And that arrangement was completed. And for a number of years, we exported students from the church to mainly through the college, over to the Middle East. It was very, very successful. And those examples inspired others to find out about the church. There was in Germany, after the change in the guard with Willy Brandt becoming the Chancellor of Germany, a former press secretary was now free to travel, and he came upon Ambassador College, and he claimed that that was one of the most beautiful places on earth. Basically wrote to his relatives and says, "I think I've been to heaven." And then there was Franz Joseph Strauss, another regional leader in Germany, and he was impressed. He found out from others and came to see the campus himself. And he said, spending one day there on the Ambassador College campus was the happiest day of my life. when he left Pasadena and went to the East Coast to do business, he sent his wife back to Pasadena so that she could have an extra day on the campus. It was, in fact, voted several times, 3 times, the most beautiful and best maintained campus in America. And it was a very, very significant part of the church's history, in my opinion, because these different people that were so impressed, they told others. And it led to Mr. Armstrong's visits with 6 different prime ministers in a row of Japan, and multiple visits with the prime ministers of Israel. There were people like Margaret Thatcher that were quite impressed with him. One of the bodyguards told one of our people, Mrs. Thatcher really likes Mr. Armstrong. Menachem Begin one time said, Mr. Armstrong, if you were to come to this country in the middle of the night, I would wake up to come and see you. And he did have grace and favor with a lot of people. I understand there's some controversy on this matter because Mr. Armstrong had various advisors, some that did not have the best interests of the church at heart, and for their own reasons, spent money to arrange for different meetings with heads of state. But there were a lot of genuine contacts. And especially there would be times when some of those people said, why did you bring the bad people with you? It's good that you're just here by yourself. Even they could see through things that Mr. Armstrong himself couldn't. His wife wasn't there to help him. But there were other times when other people were very, very impressed and thrilled. The King and Queen of Thailand. After Mr. Armstrong died, Queen Sirikit wanted to keep a relationship with the college, and she was quite upset when the new set of leaders didn't want anything to do with this international activity. She was quite upset, but she absolutely was thrilled with the previous direction of the church, the college, and its management. And I could go on with some of the very positive connections that happened. But the main thing was that these things happened after a major church fast because the loss of Wilma Armstrong was a huge trial for the church. And I think that the brethren sensed it. So I've rehearsed some of the other turning points that the church had. And those had to happen. They had to happen for the church to continue to go on the right path, for it to achieve what God wanted it to. And we see through a glass darkly now. Again, I've said that we don't know exactly for sure what we could do. It will become more obvious if we continue to be in a state of prayer and occasionally fast and back up this particular weekend with personal dedication to renew ourselves, to want to be more usable in the hands of God in a very positive way. We have that to look forward to. We can expect God to answer these kind of prayers. We need as an organization to do more than we've done in the past. We are not a household name yet with most people throughout the world. We just are not. There are things that we need to perfect, things that we need to improve on. I don't know what will happen for sure, but we have to be ready for anything. Clues for the future can be found by looking at what's happened in the past. We can see where time and time again the church would fast, and we would get some very, very all-encompassing results that affected everybody. You don't know what can happen. I've used the example of the Reader's Digest. There was a time in South Africa when we wondered how will we ever connect with the people there, the populace. And they're English-speaking people. We don't have to translate. How can we reach South Africa? And it was interesting that Mr. Armstrong was invited to speak to the Lions Club there in Johannesburg. And one of his assistants was asked by Mr. Armstrong to arrange some kind of a meeting with the Rotarians or the Lions Club, whoever that was. It didn't just automatically happen. And this person thought, well, yeah, how do we do this? He got on an elevator and he was going down to the bottom floor, and he encountered somebody there, and they made some small talk, and our person said, "Huh, I suspect that you're from. You sound like you're from this part of the world." He says, "Well, yeah. How did you know?" He says, "Well, it's just a hobby of mine. I'm able to hear accents and pinpoint where people are living from." So the man says, "Yeah, I'm in a dilemma. I'm a part of the Alliance Club, and I've been asked to find somebody to speak on world peace, and I don't know where to begin." And our person said, "Well, I think I know somebody that could help you out here. Just give me your phone number, whatever, and I'll get back with you in a few minutes." And that's how that was arranged. It's amazing when you see God's hand in the picture, where God will work things out. And I believe that we should expect to see miracles in the future where God will. The other thing that made me think of South Africa was we did send some TV program video down there to be played on a Sunday morning, and the time wasn't that good. And on Saturday night, prime time is like 7:30 to 9 o'clock. And the TV program Kojak from the U.S. was being played there, but they had a mix-up with their programming, and they ended up sticking Mr. Armstrong right behind Kojak. So he had, the entire TV audience of South Africa, in the palm of his hand, in a sense. And he had a very powerful message. It was filming from the Philippines, and he was pounding the table. And if people don't repent, God will pull the rug out from under them, in a sense. He was trying to get their attention. It's not typically good international protocol to have that kind of an approach, but the church got away with it. What was said was said. And these are the things that can happen if a person or a group or a church is close to God. We can't afford to have missed opportunities. We want God to be in our lives. You never know what can happen. The sermon I gave last week, talking about one person who called at the end of the huge rush on the Watts line back in worldwide days when we were there. And that last phone call represented somebody that wanted to donate $500,000, and that was back in that time. We can't discount what God can do, but we can't be the weak link in it, or else nothing happens. In fact, when nothing happens, then I think a lot of people get concerned. So maintenance is better than crisis management of our lives. Maintenance, where we plan to occasionally fast. And we don't need for church administration to inspire us to do it, that we're going to be self-starters. We're going to want to do that, and perhaps have been doing that all along. It's just vital to a Christian's growth, because we are not going to accomplish anything on our own. Mr. Armstrong set an example when he would so often get away from the college campus. He loved being there, but sometimes if we're in our familiar environment, there are so many distractions, so many things that we can take for granted, so many interruptions that can take us off course, or a little bit off course, can diminish our time with God, when we could instead be praying, followed by a segment of praying, studying, and then meditating, and then rotating it. He would go to Palm Springs, out in the desert, rent a small place, and he would spend a day, day and a half, 2 days, whatever it took, in prayer and fasting to rejuvenate. He called it the 36-hour cure, to go out into the desert. And I remember this was brought out in early refresher programs by Dean Blackwell. It was a perfect strategy. And it enables people to understand, to see the right side of issues. There have been times in my life where people said, This is the way, walk you in it, and you need to decide right now. And all those other people, well, they're evil, and you just stick with us, and you just go ahead. There's no substitute for having had time with God. If you ever get into that situation, say, what you're asking me to do is so important that I need to get closer to God. You wouldn't deny me that, would you? Oh, no. And allow God to direct your thinking, whereas I want him to direct mine, that will be on the right side of every issue that ever may be controversial, that will be able to see and be able to reprove what we've always known to be true. I'm talking about solid doctrine and heart and core Christianity, where it's always going to be more blessed to give than to receive. That the basics of life is to reach out to people and to help people and to proclaim positive good news in the time of trouble, to reassure people, but also direct their attention to the fact that life is cause and effect, and that we can write our own tickets. We can determine our future by our spiritual choices and by what we do with our time. And if it's allotted to God, then we're going to be blessed to be able to understand what is around us, to be sound-minded and not have the spirit of fear and timidity, but of power and a sound mind. It comes from being close to God. Fasting is the tool in which to do it. Oh, would Satan love to get rid of that tool, hide it somewhere, distract us, discourage us from using it. Because even though life seems to slow down, our closeness to God accelerates. We are advancing faster when we're in a prayer and fasting mindset that is extended for a day or two. That is more significant than not fasting at all. We make faster progress, and we have a direct line to God. As I mentioned again, closest distance between 2 points is a straight line. When we're not close to God, we can meander, we can deviate, we can get off course. We can get distracted and look away. Try plowing a field looking away. And I can guarantee that you won't have a straight line. Nobody will. It's in our hands. We have history to learn from and rely on. I just marvel at some of the things that were written in the past. This is a 12-page letter. I'm not saying that every time our previous leader sneezed, it was inspired, but I would love to have his batting average. I really would. Even right here, right now, as I am. I think that would be a marvelous blessing. Very few people were able to spend that much time with Mr. Armstrong. He had God's Spirit for about 55 years, and that is a milestone. But maybe we will be setting other milestones. Maybe we will be doing exploits that will be recorded in the book of Acts. I think based on our history and from what I've covered, we should fully expect God to do greater things with this church. It's not by our might, it's not by clever insight, but godly wisdom that comes from yielding ourselves to Him. That is the person that God will look at, Isaiah 66:2. Let's strive to do that. Let's work for unity and work for asking God to show us plainly where He wants to take this church. He's shown us in the past. He's taken us to new levels, new heights, and He can do even more. We only limit Him by our shortcomings. So let us fast to get rid of those, to reduce the drag that we put on what God is trying to accomplish. Let us be valiant servants in the most important organization, the most important work on the face of the earth.